May, and they ceased operations on the 3rd of December. They were commanded by a Major Day. Major Day had the military cross, as you can see. He retired to the area after an illustrious war period in World War I and a later career in mining, and we'll talk about him later. The company had about 202 men. In fact, at the conclusion of or stand down, it was 213. And our particular platoons specialized in mobility. That means getting to wherever they were needed very quickly, with the exception of the Christian Malford and the Sutton Venger platoons, who had got static positions looking after bridges, road bridges, railway bridges, which were deemed to be essential if the enemy should arrive. Now, I'm very lucky that Robert Pegler at Elm Farm had a photograph, or his mother did, had a photograph of the entire company taken at Elm Farm. The building that's behind unfortunately caught fire at the end of the war and is no longer there. But there is the entire 200 of H Company, with Major Day sitting in the middle, looking quite comfortable there, with the only one with a peak cap, and I thought that was highly significant. So let's just recap. H Company then, we're going to be looking at the 3 top platoons: Bremhill platoon, Tytherton platoon, Spurthill platoon, and Foxham platoon. I'm not covering the other 2. Well, I might if we have time a little bit. The Christian Malford and Sutton Venger. So it's just the 3 platoons. So over 100 men in those. Once again, you can see now who's in charge. We've got Major Day, as I mentioned earlier. The second in command was Gold, a chap called Captain Gold, and then a doctor in Chippenham, who was Dr. Ayres. Then we had the Pegler, Clive Pegler, Burtill, and Clive Hillier as officers of the platoons, plus obviously the other ones from the other platoons. So 40 men under Clive Hillier and 32 in Foxham. Initially, they had a retired army officer there who was running the show, but he retired under the age rule and another gentleman took over. Mr. Brining lived at Cadnam Manor, I believe, Martin, and until 1945-ish when he died. Hello, John. Good evening. So there we go. Tytherton, Spurthill, we just mentioned, under Fuller Burtill, initially Robert Baker. So I mentioned about Mark Day. He got the Military Cross. And as Louise knows, when you start getting into something, you start looking, what did he get the Military Cross for? And he, in fact, was at Arras, and he was a mining engineer, and he was doing the tunneling underneath the enemy lines. And he was gazetted in January 1917 for his outstanding courage. And that's how he got his Military Cross in all those underground tunnels at Arras. Now, to recap, the regiment structure is regiment first, and it's Wiltshire Regiment, number 1 regiment. Then we have the battalion, then we have a company, and then we have platoons. And within the platoons, we might or might not have platoon sections. Let's look at the problem now. I'm sure you all recognize that symbol. Well, that was really the problem. The never-ending rise of the Nazi empire and empire building across Europe. The Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, went for a cup of tea in 1938 with Adolf Hitler, and we see them there having a cup of tea. The outcome was a declaration of peace in our time, and this was beautifully accepted across the country. What a wonderful thing. We're not going to go to war after all. However, the powers that be knew that war was imminent. So it gave us a year, 18 months to start doing a bit of planning and look at what might happen when we were at war. So there was an encouragement for people to join the Royal Observer Corps, join the air raid wardens, and also humour came into it as well, and postcards starting to appear, as you can see, to get the armament workshops up. And we see there that blackout time tonight is at 5:45. I think it was a bit later. And then all hell let loose. The Germans invaded Poland in September of 1939. We were hoping it wouldn't happen, but it did. We thought about it a little while, and then we declared war.
I am speaking to you from the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, thinking that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Oh dear. Very, very significant is the use of the wireless. And most of these messages in the war came across the BBC. But there was also, as you just heard, Lord Haw hanging around. Lord Haw always used to give a lot of misinformation, but sometimes some interesting information. So people did listen, but mainly it was the BBC. And the announcers became quite a friend to people because they always announced themselves saying, hello, I'm David Wood or Anana Dell or whatever their name was. So people knew all the newsreaders and their names. And of course, most importantly, their voice. And that was quite important. Lord Haw was William Joyce, as many of you know, an Englishman, yes, and he spoke, as they all did in those days, very, very nicely. He was the last person in England to be hung for treason in 1946. Then, of course, after the war, going back a little bit, the war had started, but nothing much happened. But a lot of rumour started to appear, like the Germans have landed and they're marching from Cadnam to West End with their band playing. Aren't they lovely soldiers? So the Phony War happened. And then maybe they are coming down at Bremhill from the aeroplanes dressed as nuns. Oh, I saw a nun shaving the other day. So we had lots of Phony War. And this continued for 6 months, basically. And in that 6 months, we managed to get the expeditionary force across to France. And we didn't do very well. France was about to capitulate 6 months later. And quite frankly, we were in trouble. The method of attack in France and in Poland and in Denmark had always been by parachute initially, coming from Junkers J-52s. So that was the worry. And then there was a change of government. Neville Chamberlain was thrown out and Winston Churchill took over in September 1940. His Secretary of War was a chap called Anthony Eden, who had met on several occasions in my youth as he was MP for Leamington Spa, where I was born. So the Phony War, and then, as I say, it all started to go wrong. Anthony Eden came on the airwaves on the 14th of May at 9 o'clock on the BBC with a very important message to people. If it plays. It takes 9 seconds before it comes on. You see, I can remember that from my notes.
I want to speak to you tonight about the form of warfare which the Germans have been employed so extensively against Holland and Belgium, namely the dropping of troops by parachute behind the main defensive line. Since the war began, the government have received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages, who are, for one reason or another, not at present engaged in military service, and who wish to do something for the defense of their country. Well, now is your opportunity. We want large numbers of such men in Great Britain, who are British subjects between the ages of 17 and 65, 17 and 65, come forward now and offer their service in order to make assurance doubly sure. The name of the new force, which is now to be raised, will be the Local Defence Volunteer.
So there we have it, the LDF. So let's just recap then. We had the meeting with Hitler, and there was going to be peace in our time. We were still planning for war. Poland was invaded. We sent the expeditionary force to France, who were due to come back imminently. So there we go. We have the LDF. Now, I think it's important that we look at this slide because it gives an indication of the sort of thing that the government was worried about. As soon as France fell, we were going to have the 16th, 9th and 6th German armies poised to come over. And this has been drawn up from some of the German plans. And you can see there was going to be a first point of call, which was going to be the south coast. And you can clearly see where they were hoping to invade. But more importantly, we have the second line, which is just above Oxford, going from Gloucester to Malden, which is where their second offensive was due to hold and reinforce. The reason being that Oxford there was going to be the German regional headquarters in England. The Bodleian has records of this, the actual German notes on how to set up their HQ in Oxford, not London. So Oxford was not badly bombed at all because it was going to be the HQ. Well, that was the theory. So this is the extent of the airborne landings that the Bremhill and District Home Guard might be repelling. But across the country, after Eden spoke, we had 250,000 men, 250,000 men by the week. And we had over 50 in Bremhill Parish the next day. And as you can see from the slide, within 4 weeks, 1.2 million people had signed up to the LDF, Local Defence Volunteers. And here we see them with their armbands on and no uniforms and looking like a nice bunch of chaps. Love the trilby. They were nicknamed very quickly as Look, Duck and Vanish because part of their brief was to do just that. Now, the aeroplane that we're talking about was the Junkers J-52, and it was, I suppose, the DC-3 of the German Air Force. It was a civilian airliner initially, and we can see one on the right at Croydon Airport in commercial service. I draw your attention to that hangar. In a moment, I'll tell you a little bit about that. So that was the aeroplane, an interesting aeroplane, corrugated structure, a large tail, and very, very evidently, it got 3 engines. Not many aeroplanes had 3 engines. So the Home Guard aeroplane spotters had an advantage straight away. It was the only 3-engine aeroplane Germany had got. And I don't think we'd got any in the UK at the time. So that's Croydon Airport. And I'm showing you a picture of Croydon Airport because my great-grandmother lived there, 281 Thornton Road, and that's the hangar. I'm afraid to admit this, but I spent my misspent youth at Croydon Airport, and reading or preparing these notes, I've realised my first flight was in a Junkers J-52, because I used to cross the road here into that hangar and have a cup of tea with the chaps. And they were converting, I now have worked out, some ex-German, ex-British Airways aircraft into Swissair aircraft, because I can distinctly remember the corrugated, the 3 engines and the big cross on the end. And it wasn't a swastika, it was Swissair. So that's why I'm showing it, drawing your attention to Croydon Airport. So there we go. This was the big worry. All the paratroopers were going to come down, land in Bremhill from a Junkers J-52. Well, that's supposed to be playing engine noises. So this was the vision, that they were going to descend here, paratroopers galore, Maud Heath would look on, and the Home Guard would need to be there pretty smartish. There was a first meeting of the LDF was held at Wood and Aldridge offices in Bremhill. And it's a real shame that I can't see my notes because I had written down the 3 objectives that these senior people prepared on that day. and I really cannot quite remember them accurately, but I've seen the minutes. And one was to stop them coming by blockading the roads and the railway lines. Another one was to report all odd things happening in the area. And another one was to be mobile to attack people at the first opportunity. There was only one trouble: they didn't have any equipment. Now, this didn't go down very well in Berlin, because it effectively was another 1 million people they were going to have to fight. So that's in German. I was going to ask Ewan, if he's on site, I can't see him anywhere, to tell me what that says. What did it say, Ewan? He's not here.
I am here, David. I'm 2 pictures above you on the screen. It says, just if you look at it, there are just a couple of things to point out. On the 3rd line, at the end of the 3rd line, Frankenreifen is absolutely meaningless. It's a bad translation and has been written down by mistake with somebody writing it in. Reifen is, in fact, tires, car tires, bike tires. It means nothing. But as I changed it and translated it as partisans. So it would read, the German authorities warn once again the misled British people and remind them of the fate of the Polish partisans and gangs of murderers. Civilians who take arms, the actual German says defend themselves against, but that doesn't, again, quite make sense here. So I've taken a little liberty and changed it to civilians who take arms against a German soldier are, according to international law, no better than rank murderers, whether priests or bank clerks. British people, you would do well to pay attention to our warning. Okay?
Well, thank you, Ewan. So an interesting note from Germany, not particularly well written, and what it means is if you join the Home Guard and we come over, we're going to shoot you straight away because you're effectively civilians. So panic stations in Britain, what are we going to do about it? So do we have uniforms? What do we do? What do we do? However, Churchill, always on the job, he said, right, we'll name them the Home Guard and effectively we'll give them uniforms. So this was only a few weeks after they'd been formed and been issued with armbands. So they became the Home Guard. The newspapers widely published this, that they needed uniforms. And I don't know whether you've got big screens, little screens, whether you can read that, but it was a bit of a poser because bear in mind, at the time, we'd got the British Expeditionary Force being evacuated, along with their uniforms and their equipment. So it was a big problem to make uniforms. So this is where a lot of volunteers came in, the ladies, and started making some uniforms. And the first uniform was basically a boiler suit, but sort of military looking, and a beret with, of course, the obligatory armband. So from 1940 then, we had no uniform. To 1944, it slowly evolved and they were fully equipped with the same uniforms as the British Army. Now, before I move on, we've got the formation. I wanted you to know that there's quite a lot of archives on the subject that take quite a few hours to read. By far the most important are, for locally, is in the local history centre, where they actually do have a register, a handwritten register, which I'll show you in a moment, of the Home Guard members. There was a book written about all of them in Wiltshire by Major Mackay. That's also very useful. The Gazette and Herald has the odd article, i.e. the Home Guard attended the funeral of at St. Martin's, for instance. So you can pick that up. I had a few problems with 1 or 2 people, and the Moravian archivist was very, very helpful there and explained the problem. We also had a register, as many of you know, in 1939. That was extremely useful because it enabled me to put the Home Guard register to couple it with the 1939 register. And I'll show you that again in a moment. And I mustn't forget that some of the parishioners have been wonderfully helpful to me. The late Nancy Kite spent some hours with me identifying all of the local platoon in Bremhill platoon. And that was verified with Jim Scott. And so people have been very useful, and a similar sort of thing happened at Tytherton with people there. So a lot of resource, as you can see, we've got a lot of resource. We've got, this is the handwritten register on the left here. And we've got this book. This is the book by Mackay. So the starting point really was the battalion register. This is the entry in the history centre that one looks it up on, reference 1710-53. If anybody wants to make a note of that, they can go and have a look at the original copy. Here is one of them, and you can quite clearly see the Fs, the Free Guards and the Fortunes. It lists which platoon they were going to go in. It lists their national identity number. That's quite important. It lists the day they joined. Bear in mind, the speech was on the 14th, and this guy of May, this guy joined up on the 25th. So they reacted very quickly, these people, which is pretty terrific. It also gives you a little bit of information on this side of what they did. PB is a proficiency award. Now, I've referred several times to the 1939 National Register. It has proved invaluable in identifying the jobs, the dates of birth, the age when they joined the Home Guard of all these guys. It also led to an identity card, so that's also useful. We can see Ernie Weston there outside number 18 having a chat, and we can also then look him up on the register, and there's Ernie Weston there at 18 Bremhill. He was born on the 26th of the 3rd, 97, just at his birthday, if he'd have been around, and a labourer in the relay shop. So presumably that was Westinghouse. So you can see straight away, we've got his number, 16-1 in Bremhill. We've got his actual address. We've got his date of birth. We've got his job. So we can identify him as an individual. Identity cards. I just realised I've still got mine. And I see in the ration book, there's a few coupons left if anybody's that desperate. Now, oh dear, I haven't changed my address to Stanley. I better get on with that straight away. This is the record that I managed to put together, combining all of the ones I've told you. We've now got a comprehensive record spreadsheet, and this is the Foxham platoon. So who they are, their full names, not just an initial, when they joined, where they lived, and what their job was. So one can then carry on using normal traditional methods of researching them as an individual. Now here we have Robert Pegler, just one of the people. He was the commander of the Foxham platoon. His grandson is Robert Pegler, still at Elm Farm. His son was also there, Kenneth Pegler, who's current Robert Pegler's father. Clive Hillier, Home Farm Bremhill. He was also the leader of the Bremhill group. He's clutching the cup there that they won in a competition, but more about that later. I thought, let's look at a bit of records of these people. Why were they chosen as platoon leaders? I've discovered that all of them were chosen because in World War I, they'd been officer status or about to be officer status. So if we look at Clive Hillier, he was in the 5th Cavalry Reserve, and I can find his military records and the medals he got, which you saw him wearing in the previous photograph. Now, the interesting one is you go through his records and you find that he was a farmer, yes, but he'd been chosen to be a pilot at the end of the war. I've not managed to establish whether he was actually qualified because I can't find him in the pilot's records, but I can find him in the register, the handwritten register of the Home Guard, and he's here, Lieutenant Hillier, and there's his number, and there's the date he joined. Remember, it was the 14th of the 5th that the speech was made. The next morning he joined. He was the first man there. And there he is in the 1939 register, and we can see straight away that he'd already volunteered to be an air raid precautions warden as well. And we can see how old he was. He was born in 1897. Then this is the gentleman that caused me problems. Lieutenant Fuller Bertill. He ran the East Tytherton platoon. Here he is in 1915. He didn't live in Tytherton. He wasn't on the 1939 register. Didn't live in the area. How did he come to be leading the East Tytherton platoon? Then I spotted something that might have given me a hint that he'd gone to Canada in June of 1939. And he'd gone to the Moravian church or the province in Canada. So then I thought, he's a Moravian. And I discovered from the historian at the Moravians that whilst he was working in London, Muswell Hill, he'd been tasked to come back from Canada as soon as he could, and he came back in November. That's why he wasn't in the register. And to bring all of the important archives of the Moravian Church back to East Tytherton, because the school had closed the year earlier, and it was a valuable place to put all of the archives. So that's why he was in Tytherton. And he knew Tytherton because he'd married a local girl in 1920, and his father was the minister at Tytherton in 1912. So it all started to come together. And when the leader at East Tytherton, Sancroft Baker, reached 65, he retired, and brother Bertill took over as lieutenant in the platoon. So I found that quite fascinating to research that, because I'd also looked at all the vicars and his name just didn't appear anywhere. They were the vicars over the period which I researched, and not his name whatsoever. Now here he is on the left, just before he went to Canada. He's the gentleman on the left. And the thing I found even more fascinating, he was the Moravian minister that represented the church at the coronation of our present Queen in 1953. I'm just flabbergasted when I saw it. I love the size of the collars, by the way. Those dog collars, Jim, seem even bigger than yours. So I did mention that they'd been called up, and everybody got to do some wartime service. So people were called up in 1941 effectively to join. The Home Guard were quite surprised because they'd already got very many people there. So let's have another look then at the East Tytherton platoon. Must put my teeth in. East Tytherton platoon. Now I know it's pre-1942 because in the middle is Sancroft Baker, not Bertill. And we can quite clearly see here all the World War I soldiers or ex-soldiers, because they've got their medals there. This gentleman's even got the proper medals on. So we can see the World War I soldiers and the contribution they were starting to make. If we take the Bremhill platoon, this is taken in 1944, and I know that with certainty, we can once again see the World War I people with their medals on. And that is, I was quite surprised how well that was digitally enhanced. It came out very well. This picture is currently in the church at St. Martin's at Bremhill, and has been for as long as I've known St. Martin's, which it's kept well, hasn't it? So let's look at some of the people in the Bremhill platoon. We've got Private George Bull. He lived at number 15 Bremhill, and we see an old picture down the bottom here, and that's him in the picture of the platoon. He was the gravedigger of St. Martin's, and he was also a lengthman that looked after the roads in Bremhill and Tytherton. So he kept them all clean and tidy, a bit like the parish steward today. So he pretty important job there. So that was George Bull. His daughter was called Nancy, and she married a Mr. Kite, and Nancy Kite was his daughter. So number 15, Nancy Kite lived there for a while, and currently Mark Kite, his grandson, George's grandson, lives there now. Now we also had somebody else that's not in the photograph, Private Charles Scott. He lived at Wheeler's Cottage, just down the road here in Stanley. He was in the Home Guard for about a year, 18 months, and he was called up and he served in the army for the rest of the war. In fact, just past the war, because he was in the Berlin. He was in Berlin in the what, I can't remember what the word was now, the peacekeeping force, and they stayed on there for about another 2 years after the war. So he didn't leave till 1946, and he was a bricklayer by trade, and his son went into the ministry, and his name's the Reverend Jim Scott. Good evening, Jim, wherever you are. So what did they do? Well, we know the worry was parachutists and junkers. First thing they did, and this courtesy of Chippenham Museum, was to dig up all the road signs. That'll confuse the enemy. That'll definitely test their map reading skills. I personally would have turned a few around and put them in other places, but there we go. So this is a famous picture that's in the museum. I love it. Now, bit of a test now. What sort of aeroplane's that? Anybody recognize it? Can they hold their hand up, please? Nobody's holding their hand up. It's got 3 engines, a big tail, and you can't see it's got a corrugated side. Nobody know what it is. Okay, none of you get into the Home Guard then, because it's a Junkers J-52. So they'd identify the aircraft, the Junkers. Then if one came along and they crashed or they shot it down, and one did get shot down in Kent with a rifle, believe it or not, they would then capture the airmen and get there before the military or the police could get there. To do that, our local lads will be learning a bit of German, like hands up, Hande Husch, I think it says. Now, in 1941, Churchill made a speech and he really, really praised the Home Guard. And as a result of that, they were allowed to take over guard duties for a week at Buckingham Palace. Not ours, but they did. So what did they do? And the thing that surprises me here, they were expected to do a minimum of 12 hours a week, over and above their normal job. I find that quite excessive, particularly when only this week we read of people complaining about the hours they're working. So these are farmers mainly that could have done a 60 or 70 hour week, and they're still expected to do another 12 hours on Home Guard duties. They had to set up roadblocks, and we had one, I was told, just outside Tytherton, where there's an intersection, and they would quite often challenge people that came by. And a person, a very elderly person who's not with us anymore in Tytherton, told me that there was a specific password if you lived in Tytherton. So when you were challenged, who goes there? The password for Tytherton was, "It's me, you silly bugger." So they had roadblocks, they identified the aircraft, first aid training, they had regular rifle shooting and gun shooting and weapons training at the back of John Harris's, so I'm told. And most importantly, locally, they worked with RAF Lynham with the defence of the airfield. The airfield came of age during World War II, and they had several exercises with the defence staff there, bearing in mind that the parish is directly in line with the main runway. And one of the interesting things is that one of the techniques the Germans and the British used was to follow invading aircraft in to land and shoot them up as they landed. So one of the important jobs of the Home Guard was to try and identify the aircraft. And one thing that doesn't appear in many of the notes is that they were a PR exercise as well, because they were reassuring people that the army will defend the country, we'll defend the village. So there was quite a lot of PR there. So they attended many of the events, the fundraising events, and the church services with great regularity. And they are all reported in the national press, or the local press, I should say. So they were defending the village, and a publication went to everybody stating just that. The army will defend your country, the Home Guard will defend your village. One of the big things they were worried about is that in the occupied, or not occupied, the defeated countries, a lot of people had run out of the village and clogged the roads. One of the jobs of the Home Guard was to keep people at home so the roads didn't get clogged up. The other thing they were doing was working on the searchlight. Now, there was a searchlight between Stanley and Tytherton, And apparently, I'm told by William Bailey, it is still known as Searchlight Field. I'd be interested if anybody else knows any more about that, but that's what I'm told. And I mentioned earlier Lynham. It was attacked on 19th of September when it was still being constructed, and 4 people sadly died there. Now, if we move on to Operation Sea Lion, and this is one of the original maps that the Germans prepared to invade England. One of their jobs, as we mentioned earlier, was to just stop that by any means. A lot of books were published. I'll give you an example here. Apparently, John Harris's dad tells me his dad was an instructor, and he had several of these books. I was particularly interested that Roland Penrose had written the book there, because he worked for the camouflage department, which I mentioned Leamington Spa for Eden before, because that's where I was born, but the camouflage school was at Leamington Spa as well, with Penrose there. He later went on to marry Lee Miller, who some of you might know. She was the ex-model stroke photographer that went to Belsen and pictured Belsen, but she was also had her picture taken in Hitler's bath, which went around the world, a very famous picture. So weapons, I love this one. This was a publicity one from the Imperial War Museum. I just don't know, I dread to think what happened to the white tablecloth. So they had a various range of grenades, mortars, Smith gun, projectors, rifles, American and English, but a lot of them were improvised weapons. And for instance, the Smith gun was one of those, made by Trianco. That's a company that made trains and toys, and they made this. So you towed it along in your car. Bear in mind they were a mobile platoon, sorry. You towed it along, turned it on its side, and blasted the enemy with the drain pipe that was sticking out of the end. No rifling for accuracy or anything like that. I had a discussion with Brigadier Powell on it some years ago, and he was in the Home Guard when he was a senior at school. And apparently nobody go near a Smith gun. He reckoned it killed more Home Guard people than it did Germans. Sten gun, I think you all know about the Sten gun, made in Enfield, hence the EN, and the 2 initials are the 2 designers' surname. So it's called a Sten gun. It was cheap and known as the Woolworth gun. It was, in today's money, only cost about £100 to make. In today's money, it was, in theory, would fire 500 rounds, but after 500 rounds, it'd be so hot you wouldn't fire any for the rest of the day. Blacker bomber, you can see here again, very much improvised device, not a shell as such, but a mortar would fire out of that. The sticky bomb, now this is really something. You unwrapped it, there was a sticky cover in there, you pulled the pin out and you threw it. If you pulled it through too far back, it might touch your shoulder and stick to you. Now, what happened to all these guns and armaments? Well, I mentioned earlier that people found them in their back garden. We've got them covered up with roads and drives locally. Some of it was handed in, some of it wasn't. John, who's watching tonight, did that for me. And apparently he's found various cartridge cases probably on his premises. So be careful where you dig in the parish. Now, just to emphasize that, here's Robert Pegler.
The garage, it was an awful mess in there, been there since the war, and found some sticky bombs in there, 5 of them, which necessitated the need for the bomb disposal squad to come and blow them up.
What sort of year was that then, Robert?
It would have been something like 62, 63.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay.
So 20 years after the end of the war, we'd got sticky bombs being discovered. Apparently they carefully took them to the pond at Elm Farm, and the pond is now twice the size it was in 1960, if anybody wants to go and check. Towards start of 1944, they started having standards of operations and encouraging everybody to carry on training and take a certificate of proficiency covering most of the activities that you would expect them to do. LMG, by the way, is a Lewis machine gun. So we've got on the records I told you about earlier, we've got when they were awarded their proficiency award and the date it was awarded. So we know who got an award in what. Now, D-Day, 6th of June, the Home Guard for 6 weeks before was put on special alert because the feeling was that if the Germans discovered what was about to happen, they might send paratroopers over to do a rearguard action to stop all the troops getting to the ports. So the Home Guard were at action stations again, went just as things were quietening down. Now we've got in the village, not the village hall, in St. Martin's, we've got a picture of the cup. And this cup was won by our Bremhill platoon for, believe it or not, firing an accuracy of the Smith gun. The War Register said it was Foxham platoon that won it, but I think as it's in our church, or Bremhill church, I think it's fair to assume that it was Bremhill. Now, the stand down happened on the 3rd of December, and we can see here the troops, or the Home Guard troops, marching back through Chippenham from John Coles Park on disbandment. If you look carefully, you can see a band playing there. That's the bridge that goes over the river. They're coming up towards this direction, and that's the band. And amazingly, Chippenham platoon had a Home Guard band. Later became Chippenham Town Band. They also had a goat as a mascot. Now we're not talking about Chippenham platoon, but we didn't have a goat as a mascot in Bremhill. So it was all over, and we had a thank you from the King. Everybody had a letter, and in 1946 they got a medal. So there we go. That's the Home Guard, and that's 48 minutes. So thank you everybody for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if there's any questions, let's unmute and ask me.
David, that was fantastic. A really beautifully researched, beautifully delivered, even without your notes, and some of the best images we've seen on any talk we've had. So thank you for that. Particularly liked your CGI, or whatever you call it, of animating the individual characters from the photographs. Beautifully done. So let me open up for questions. Who would like to make any comments or questions for David on that fantastic piece of work? Ashley.
Thanks, Martin, and thank you, David. That was absolutely brilliant and really, really interesting. And particularly interested the photo that you've just showed of Chippenham in the High Street. It looks absolutely beautiful. I'm just sort of sad that I haven't had the opportunity to see it in that state, as it looks very different to what it does today. Doesn't it look magnificent? And that was just a comment, really. My question to you would be, I'm just sort of interested in, is this a sort of a lifetime's work for you in terms of all this research? And there must have been an enormous amount of research that you've done in the background. And is it something that you're still actively researching and trying to find out more, or is it sort of closed for you?
I think, well, thank you for your nice comments, Ashley. I think that I do enjoy researching, and I've spent some time on it because I've been out of action for a year, as most of us have, but me probably more than most, in that I had a knee replacement on March the 13th, so I've had an excuse to do a bit more research. As regards doing any more, as Louise and others of you know, you can never stop researching. I could research forever the Home Guard, the local Home Guard. I've still got 2 more platoons to do if I wanted to, but what I'm going to do is put together a bit more of a story, something to go in the Victoria County thing with Louise, which I promised her I'd do, and then I'll probably do a little booklet similar to the one I did with the World War I soldiers, listing who were, where they lived. But that's no rush for that. That'll be over the next couple of years. I won't do any more work as I've done here.
Right, thank you, David. Any further questions from the crowd? Anybody?
Now, if anybody wanted to have any more time, I can tell you what got me onto this, if you want to.
Let's just. Sarah's got a question for you.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, David. Again, I thought that was absolutely amazing. So thank you very much. I did notice on the register, probably about a third of the way through, that there were some female names. Was that correct?
No, it wasn't correct.
Okay.
I think you brought up an interesting subject, though, females. It could be the subject of a complete lecture, but initially there was incredible, there weren't any locally that I've found, but they did support in other ways, taking the tea out when they were at night camps and helping make the LDF badges. But more importantly, in other parts of the country, they did have an opportunity to work with the Home Guard, maybe as radio operators, as transport drivers, that sort of occupation, but I have not found any in the Wiltshire Regiment. I've got some pictures of them shooting rifles, but not locally.
Thank you. And then my final one, and I didn't know whether they got paid or not.
Ah, right. They didn't. It was completely voluntary. But after a year or so, they got a small allowance of 1 6 or something if they did after 4 hours for refreshments. So what they did locally, I understand, is they saved up their 1 6 and used to go in the pub, and then they'd send the bill. They didn't actually get the money, but they'd send the bill to platoon headquarters in Chippenham. And I understand that the first time they tried it, the bill was sent back because it said beer after exercises. The next one they rewrote with refreshments during exercises, and it was paid.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Just follow Sarah's point there, David. As we know, every parish, every village had to have a war book in which they wrote out all their plans for how they were going to cope with any invasion coming in. And interestingly, if you look at the Bremhill one, you've got men doing all of the men's jobs, so to speak, and the women were always put down as in charge of food, in charge of clothes, in charge of the infirmary. And that it was a clear distinction. And looking at the PCC committee minutes throughout the whole of the war, again, it was interesting to see that when it came to those present, it had those present, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, oh, and Mrs. So-and-so, right at the end. So there was a clear distinction. But in the war book as well, just to sort of reinforce everything that David said too, there was one sentence which I rather liked that was written down. In the event of invasion, advice given to the public who are entreated not to be openly aggressive. Do not have a shot at the enemy. Leave it to the Home Guard. For the point that they weren't in uniform, and if you weren't in uniform, you had a shot. Presumably, everybody being on a farm had guns, and if you'd had a shot at the enemy, you were fair game, and that was it. And it went on to say, if asked by the enemy to provide labour or information, give as little as possible. Hide some, but not all of your food. So if they come, you can give them a little bit just to sort of play along and maybe, keep things going a little bit and avoid aggression. But all of that was quite clearly written down on what they had to do.
But yes, you're so right there that they were told to go along with it, really. But behind the scenes, and you don't really hear of this very often, there was something called the Home Guard Auxiliaries. Has anybody heard of that? The Home Guard Auxiliaries? There's a big Wiltshire connection here. They were Churchill's secret army. They were the British resistance. Now, another talk on the subject, but if anybody, when we're allowed out, wants to go to Coleshill House near Swindon, ask about the auxiliaries. That was their headquarters. That's where they were trained. And the idea was that the auxiliaries all kept low until the enemy had gone over them, and then they started the rearguard action. They were given various accommodation in, well, bluntly, they were underground shelters all around the county, and they were the auxiliaries, and they were all nominally told they were home guard. And the other thing I'd like to say, Ewan, is your comments there is, as far as the parish council was going and looking at the parish council meetings, the main preoccupation was the trip hazard on the pavement or something like that. The war was only mentioned in passing, which I found quite fascinating.
I never found, in looking at the parish council minutes or anything else, I never found a single mention of the war, nor of VE Day or anything like that. As far reading the minutes, you wouldn't know there'd been anything on.
Just goes to show that historic documentation is often incomplete. Any other questions or comments from our audience for David tonight?
Deadly hush.
I've got one for you, David. What have you not been able to find out that you would love to know the answer to? Is there a specific question you'd like to leave?
Yes, there is. And now everybody's going to think I've primed you for that question, Martin. I have managed to locate everybody in the register, where they lived, who they are, and what their job was, their age. There was one gentleman in the Foxham group, and his surname was Nye, N-Y-E, and his initials were N-M. Nowhere in the country is there a Mr. N-M Nye in the 1939 census, or the register, or the 1911 census, or the 1901 census. There is a lady called N-M-Y, Sarah, but no man. So I think we might have had a fifth columnist. Well, it says he went in the register. It says he joined the Royal Marines. I've looked at the Royal Marines register and he didn't, or I can't find him.
No relation that I'm aware of.
Germany.
I will ask questions of other family members, but there was no previous connection with the parish until I married Victoria.
But interestingly, that is the one that I really had trouble with. I had trouble with the Moravian gentleman Bertil, but then it all sort of, once you've got a lead, it starts, as I'm sure Louise knows, it starts unraveling. And I found it quite fascinating about the Canadian connection and the Newfoundland connection, and the fact that he actually saved all the Moravians' archives by bringing them to the school in Tytherton. I mean, I just didn't know that until she told me.
Some great detective work there, David.
Yes, I was quite intrigued by that bit.
Very, very, very satisfying.
Okay, well, my hour is now up, Martin. I have got, as I said to you earlier, a little bit more of how I got involved, if anybody wants to see it. But we have got a football match to watch in a while, and I know some of us have got a Zoom conference.
I would like to propose that we save some of that for another occasion. There's so much rich material that I think there'll be another occasion, and I think there's 2 or 3 aspects of this which we'd like to explore further. So, well, I personally need to drop off, but if anybody else wants to stay on, they're most welcome. But David, I can't emphasize enough, that was a really stimulating, fascinating, wide-ranging talk that we all appreciated. So you're getting a good round.
Pleased you enjoyed it, and I will get Louise some notes on the subject to go in her publication.
Thank you very much. Much